Deaths and burials of the kings and queens of England. The Tudors and the Stuarts. All men must die, even kings, and not even a golden crown can pay off the Grim Reaper. In this 4-part series, we'll bid a final farewell to all 58 deceased English and British monarchs, from Æthelstan to Elizabeth II. We'll dig up their medical records and deathbed secrets, uncover where and how they were buried, and reveal if their remains rest in peace. In today's episode, we'll say goodbye to the Tudor and Stuart monarchs, 2 of whom lost their heads to the axe, 2 sacrificed their health to over-indulgence, and 1 damaged his kidneys by playing with mercury. And now let's offer our condolences to the Tudors. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, joining the Red and White Roses and ending the Wars of the Roses. During his reign, the wool trade grew, and so did England's wealth. But Henry had inherited a bankrupt government and taxed his people heavily. He named his eldest son Arthur after the ancient warrior king. Sadly, the prince died of the sweating sickness at 15. The normally reserved Henry shocked his courtiers with his sobbing and intense grief. He was again distraught when his beloved wife, Elizabeth, died a year later in childbirth. Then he had to bid farewell to his darling daughter Margaret and sent her to marry King James IV of Scotland to seal a peace treaty. At his counselor's urging, the king sent ambassadors to look for a second wife. His description of the woman he would accept exactly matched Elizabeth, and no princess could meet these high standards. Sadness and greed took over Henry's heart. He also suffered a quinsy, an abscess behind his tonsils, and consumption, aka tuberculosis. In March 1509, the miserable 52-year-old king stopped eating. He continued in agony for a month. On April 20th, he took to his bed with his confessor and died the next day. Henry was laid to rest next to Elizabeth in a tomb of marble and gilt bronze under the spectacular Lady Chapel he had constructed in Westminster Abbey. Henry VIII, a handsome, tall, and athletic 17-year-old, promptly married his older brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. They had a happy marriage, which was ravaged by 4 miscarriages and stillbirths. Their only living son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, died at just 52 days old of a bronchial infection. Their only surviving child was a daughter, Mary. Henry was determined to have a son to continue his fledgling dynasty, so he broke from the Catholic Church, made himself head of the Church of England, and granted himself an annulment. He dissolved the monasteries and sent his cronies to loot their wealth. They robbed and destroyed the tombs of many previous monarchs. When Henry was 35, he fell from his horse during a joust and lay unconscious for an hour. He recovered but suffered a leg wound, which plagued him for the rest of his life, ending his athleticism and allowing him to pile on weight. Historians hypothesize he also endured brain damage, which could explain his hair-triggered temper, though he may have already had a borderline or narcissistic personality disorder. Being told from childhood that you're God's representative on Earth can do that. In his quest for a son, Henry ruined the lives of 5 more wives, 3 of whom he sent to an early grave. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on false charges of adultery. Jane Seymour died of childbed fever after delivering the king's only son. And Catherine Howard was beheaded for actual adultery, though she was desperate to produce a child for her vicious and impotent husband. Only wives number 4 and 6, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr, survived the mad monarch. Catherine nursed the aging, ill-tempered king and tried to distract him from the pain and stench of his leg wound, which doctors kept open so they could regularly drain it of pus. Decades of rich, fatty meats, sweets, and wine with few vegetables and no exercise expanded the royal waistline to 54 inches and gave Henry gout. By 53, he weighed 400 pounds. He had to be hoisted to his second-floor apartments on a chair precariously pulled by ropes. He was carried everywhere in a sedan chair by 6 sweaty yeomen. His eyesight failed, and he ordered wire-frame spectacles from Germany. He eventually had to give up signing documents, and a stamp of the king's signature was made. Henry was frequently depressed, suffered violent mood swings, and became increasingly paranoid and psychotic. His doctors burned away the infected tissue on his leg with red-hot irons. This torturous treatment actually gave him some relief, but it was clear that he would soon meet his maker. His doctors were terrified to tell him, so they pressured the groom of the stool, who was used to having the worst job in the palace, to inform His Majesty that the end was nigh. Henry sent his wife and children away, called for Archbishop Cranmer, and said, "I will take a little sleep." They were his last words. He slipped into a coma and died on January 27, 1547. Henry VIII is one of the most popular monarchs to posthumously diagnose. Historians' medical theories include Cushing's syndrome, McLeod syndrome, scurvy, and diabetes. Most now dismiss the salacious claim that he had syphilis. Henry's demise was kept secret for 4 days, while his 9-year-old son's uncle seized the regency. After the death was announced, vigils were held over the embalmed body for 10 days. On the 2-day journey to Windsor, 1,000 mourners on horseback and hundreds more on foot stretched 4 miles behind the elaborate gilded chariot. It was covered with 1,000 candles and a 35-foot canopy. Henry's coffin was draped in black velvet and heraldic banners, and topped with an effigy of the king dressed in royal robes with the imperial crown on its head. This multi-ton monstrosity was drawn by 8 horses ridden by children. The entourage stopped for the night at Sion Abbey, and according to legend, Henry's corpse, now getting ripe, exploded, and his coffin leaked foul fluids. It was said that dogs licked up His Majesty's blood, an echo of the divine justice of biblical King Ahab, whose corpse was licked by dogs after he allowed his wife Jezebel to convert Israel to paganism, much as Henry had converted his own nation to Protestantism for Anne Boleyn. When Henry finally arrived at St. George's Chapel, he was laid in a vault next to his third queen, Jane Seymour. He intended this to be a temporary resting place. He'd had an artist design an elaborate tomb, which incorporated a life-sized marble sculpture of himself on horseback, surrounded by gilded angels and saints. But he was superstitious and would not allow the construction to begin while he was alive. His will dictated that his son should pay for the grand monument, but Edward was a fervent Protestant and frowned on his father's popish tomb. After he died, his sisters, Mary I and Elizabeth I, also never got around to building their father's tomb, perhaps because of how horrendously he had treated their mothers. Henry VIII remains in his temporary tomb to this day. In 1813, George IV did add a simple black marble slab to mark his burial. Edward VI became king at 9. Despite many accounts calling him a sickly child, contemporaries report that Edward was robust. He and his council did much to shape the Church of England. He displayed a similar narcissism as his father, and might have grown into just as monstrous a tyrant. But at 14, he contracted measles. He recovered, but his immune system was vulnerable when tuberculosis came to call. The young king hacked up greenish-yellow phlegm tinged with black and pink blood. His exhausted body burned with fever and swollen ulcers, but his mind was sharp, and he was determined to keep the throne from his Catholic sister Mary. He signed a succession device, skipping her and Elizabeth on the grounds that they had both been declared illegitimate. Instead, he named the male heirs of his cousin, Lady Jane Grey. Edward died at 15, while a servant cradled him. He was buried in his grandfather's chapel in Westminster Abbey. His tomb was less ostentatious than the one his father had wanted, but the gilded columns and angels were far from modest. Jane had no right or desire to wear the crown, but the clever 15-year-old was a pawn in the royal council's game. The Duke of Northumberland forced her to marry his own son, Guilford Dudley, and pressured Jane to name her husband king, but she refused to surrender what little power she had. The scheme was doomed. Mary was popular and easily raised an army, marched to London, and ended Jane's reign after just 9 days. The men who had put her in this dangerous position abandoned her to save themselves. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to be burned or beheaded at the Queen's pleasure. Mary did not wish to execute her cousin, but when a rebellion broke out in Jane's favor, she signed the death warrant. Jane watched from her window as her husband was beheaded. She was then led to the scaffold and remained composed as she stepped over his blood. Blindfolded, Jane was unable to feel the block and panicked. A witness came forward to help her. With her head on the block, she spoke the last words of Jesus, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And the 16-year-old, 9 days queen, lost her head. Jane and Guilford were buried unceremoniously in the chapel of St. Peter at Vicula inside the Tower of London. She is now commemorated along with Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and other victims of the tower by a marble stone on the floor of the altar. Mary I was 37 and desperate for a Catholic heir to keep her Protestant sister Elizabeth off the throne. She fell hard for her new husband, Philip II of Spain, but he did not return her affections. 2 months after the wedding, Mary was thrilled to announce that she was pregnant. Her husband had his doubts. As the 10th and 11th months ticked by with no signs of labor, physicians assured Her Majesty that boys took longer. But by July, her swollen belly receded. She probably suffered a psychosomatic episode induced by her overwhelming desire to have a child. Following the humiliation, Philip left to wage war in Europe. Heartbroken, Mary fell into depression and was even more fervent about stomping out Protestantism. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary by burning 280 Protestants at the stake. She begged Philip to return to her, and he did, only to ask for English troops for his war. She gave him whatever he wanted, resulting in the loss of Calais, the last English possession in France. The defeat humiliated Mary, but she once more believed that she was pregnant. Again, the months ticked by with no signs of labor. And now there was a more sinister cause behind her symptoms. She was dying of uterine or ovarian cancer. Her weakened body was also struck by an influenza epidemic. Queen Mary died in her sleep at the age of 42. She had requested to be buried with her mother at Peterborough Cathedral, but the new queen, Elizabeth, threw her an elaborate funeral and buried her under the Lady Chapel in Westminster. Philip didn't bother to attend. He did come back to England, but only to propose to Elizabeth. She said no. Elizabeth I was crowned at 25. She was incredibly intelligent, an outstanding leader, and is considered one of the greatest monarchs of England. Her 44-year reign was a golden era of economic growth, exploration, and cultural blossoming. She came out victorious against Philip II's Armada attack and survived the assassination plots of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, by having her head chopped off. Elizabeth avoided the pitfalls of her predecessors by refusing to marry. She never had to share power with a husband, but the question of who would follow her loomed. By 69, Elizabeth was suffering throat ulcers, fever, and years of lead poisoning from her brilliant white makeup. For 2 weeks, she sat on a cushion on the floor. Though her counselors begged her, she refused to eat or go to bed. Suddenly, she asked her attendants to help her up, but she then remained standing with her finger in her mouth and her eyes fixed to the ground for a further 15 hours. Finally, she allowed her ladies to help her into bed, where she fell into a deep sleep and never woke up. Courtiers rushed north to inform King James VI of Scotland, Elizabeth's nearest male relative, that he was now King of England. When he arrived triumphantly in London, he spent £11,000, $2 million today, on Elizabeth's lavish funeral. Her lead coffin was carried on a torchlit barge down the Thames from Richmond to Whitehall, where it laid in state. Then to Westminster Abbey on a hearse surrounded by mourners in floor-length black robes and hoods. Common people lined the streets to weep for the great queen. Elizabeth was buried next to her sister Mary. The inscription on their tombs reads, "Consorts in realm and tomb, we sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, here lie down to sleep in hope of the resurrection." Now let's bid a final farewell to the Stuarts. James I claimed the throne through his great-great-grandfather, Henry VII, whose daughter, Margaret, married King James IV of Scotland. After centuries of English kings trying to beat Scotland into submission, the two kingdoms were finally united under the King of Scotland. James ordered the printing of the King James Bible. A group of Catholic conspirators smuggled gunpowder under the Houses of Parliament in an attempt to blow him up. But the plot was foiled and is still celebrated every 5th of November. James was openly bisexual, and one of his many lovers was found guilty of murder. In his late 50s, the king was plagued with arthritis, gout, kidney stones, and fainting fits. A sugary diet had made his teeth fall out, and he was alcohol dependent. In 1625, he fell seriously ill with malaria. He then suffered a stroke and a violent attack of dysentery. His current paramour, George, Duke of Villiers, was away in France, but George's mother, Mary, rushed to the king's deathbed. James died at 58 and was buried in the Henry VII vault in Westminster Abbey. Charles I held his father's view that a king should have absolute power. Parliament didn't agree, and they fought over the king's illegal tax schemes. Civil war broke out between the supporters of the king, called the Cavaliers, and those of Parliament, called the Roundheads. 1 in 20 English people died. Eventually, the Roundheads won and took over the government. They put the king on trial and found him guilty of treason. His wife and most of his children had fled the country, but Elizabeth and Henry were still in England to bid their father a tearful farewell. On the scaffold, the king wore 2 shirts so that he would not shiver in the January cold and appear frightened. He gave a speech protesting his sentence, but he laid his head on the block and lost it in one clean blow. He was 48. The masked executioner held the king's head up to the crowd, but he did not yell the traditional, "Behold the head of a traitor," probably because he didn't want his voice to be recognized. Charles's head was sewn back onto his body, which was embalmed and placed in a lead coffin. His enemies carried him to out-of-the-way St. George's Chapel, Windsor. He was placed in an available space in the vault of Henry VIII, without fanfare. For the first time in 700 years, England didn't have a monarch. General Oliver Cromwell declared himself Lord Protector and cracked down on the country's morality. He closed theaters and brothels, demanded everyone go to church and stay sober, and even canceled Christmas. Though he claimed to be a pious and humble man, he ruled like a king. Cromwell's regime only lasted 5 years. At 59, he fell ill with kidney stones and malaria. He refused the only known treatment, quinine, because it had been discovered by Catholic missionaries. Cromwell wanted to be buried as a king, but the weeks of preparation required for an elaborate royal funeral meant that his body turned too putrid for public view. He was buried immediately in a new vault in Westminster Abbey. Instead, a wax effigy was paraded through London. The people wanted to return to the good old days before the war, so Parliament invited Charles II back to restore the monarchy. He had all the men who'd put his father on trial hanged. The incognito executioner now looked pretty smart. Charles ordered Cromwell's rotting corpse to be exhumed and given the punishment of a traitor. He was hung in chains over Tyburn Bridge for public viewing. His head was then chopped off and his body thrown in a pit. Cromwell's head was spiked outside Westminster Hall for 24 years. It was finally taken down after Charles II died. But his skull was bought, sold, and put on public display many times. Finally, in 1960, Cromwell's cranium was buried beneath the floor of Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, where it remains to this day. Charles II was called the Merry Monarch, both for restoring England's pre-war hedonism and for his numerous mistresses and illegitimate children. His queen, Catherine of Braganza, didn't deliver any living children. During Charles's reign, bubonic plague wiped out 20% of the population, and in 1666, London burned to the ground. After 27 years of decent rule and plenty of partying, the king suffered a sudden apoplectic fit. His doctors were baffled, but his symptoms are similar to those of uremia, an excess of urine in the blood due to kidney dysfunction. Modern historians have made the connection that the king's hobby was experimenting in his laboratory. In his final days, he was tinkering with mercury. The liquid metal was once considered an elixir of life, but we now know that it is toxic and causes, among other things, kidney damage. Charles was subjected to bloodletting, purging, and cupping. Rather than saving him, they caused him dehydration and hastened his death. On his deathbed, Charles apologized to his wife for his poor treatment of her. He also converted to Catholicism, his mother's faith, which he had long admired but was forced to deny for political reasons. Charles's party ended at 54. He had a simple funeral with the coffin draped in black cloth and topped with the state crown on a purple cushion, a tradition which remains to this day. There wasn't room in Westminster Abbey for an elaborate tomb, so his wax effigy was positioned over the new Stuart vault. His brother, James II, was 52 and Catholic. The people tolerated him because his Protestant daughter, Mary, would be the next queen. But all that changed when James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy baby boy who would be raised Catholic. Parliament invited Mary and her husband, William of Orange, to sail up the Thames and claim the throne. James went on the run to France. He spent the rest of his life plotting to regain the throne, and even raised an army in Ireland, but was defeated by William. James died of a brain hemorrhage at 67. Much like the Catholic saints he admired, his body was divided into royal relics. His heart, brain, entrails, and right arm were all given to different religious orders. The rest of his body was placed in a triple sarcophagus at St. Edmund's Chapel in the Church of the English Benedictines in Paris. His coffin was displayed, surrounded by lit candles, until the French Revolution, when it was ransacked and destroyed. William III was Prince of Orange and ruler of the Dutch. His wife, Mary II, had a better claim to the English throne, but he and his powerful army insisted that he be named her co-monarch. Mary was very demure and didn't mind. She regularly walked the 3 miles between her palaces of Whitehall and Kensington. She was fit and expected to outlive her sickly husband and sister. But 5 years into her reign, she contracted smallpox. She sent away anyone who had not previously had the disease, including her own sister. Her physicians applied the standard torturous treatments of bleeding and blistering. She appeared to improve, and they hoped that she'd only had measles, but the disease had in fact turned on her internal organs. In her final hours, Mary burned her letters and journals, destroying secrets and obscuring herself from future historians. She died at 32. William was devastated. Her father James considered it divine retribution for breaking the fifth commandment. During a cold winter in which the Thames froze, Mary's embalmed body lay in state at Whitehall for 2 months. She was buried at Westminster Abbey in the Stuart vault. She had suffered at least 1 miscarriage and never bore any living children. Despite not having an heir, William refused to remarry. He was probably gay. He reigned for another 8 years, but let Parliament rule. While riding in the park, the king's horse stumbled in a mole burrow. William was thrown and broke his collarbone. While in bed recovering, he developed pneumonia and died at 51. King James toasted the little gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat, meaning the mole. William was buried next to Mary. Their wax effigies stand side by side to this day. Because Mary was 5 inches taller than her husband, William stands on a cushion. Anne inherited the throne at 37. She was married to Prince George of Denmark, but had no interest in sharing power with him, and he was totally cool with that. Anne had a long and probably romantic friendship with Sarah Churchill, but she got along well with her husband and became pregnant 17 times. Tragically, most ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. 4 of her children died in infancy. Her one great hope, her son Prince William, died at the age of 11. Modern medical historians have suggested a number of possible diagnoses for Anne's devastating fertility problems, including lupus, pelvic inflammatory disease, intrauterine growth restriction, diabetes, or Hughes syndrome, an autoimmune disease which causes thick, sticky blood. A now commonplace medicine, aspirin, might have thinned Anne's blood and saved her babies' lives. So many pregnancies took a toll on her health. She suffered gout and depression. By the time she became queen, she could barely walk, and her sedentary lifestyle caused her to gain weight. She was carried to her coronation in a sedan chair. With no clear heir to the throne, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement, which laid down the rules by which the British succession is still decided today. Anne's closest eligible relative was Sophia of Hanover, who, despite being in her 80s, was determined to outlive the sickly 49-year-old Anne. But a letter from the Queen accusing her of plotting to take the throne so shocked Sophia that she died in 1714. That year, Anne became increasingly ill. The stress of politics coincided with the anniversary of her son's death, and she suffered a stroke. She took to her bed at Kensington Palace and died the next day. Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey with her husband George, son William, and many of the other children she had lost. Don't put your shovels away yet. In the last episode, we'll go 20 feet under to explore the royal vault and the deaths of the Hanoverian, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and Windsor monarchs. While modern medicine made reigns longer and deaths more peaceful, the elaborate royal funeral traditions we see today emerged. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast. Don't want to wait to see the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all of my multi-part series. If you would like to join my Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos, click on the link in the description. Thank you for watching.